remarkable exercise spanning the past 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men and women who were there. Now, to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the armistice, these extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from the families left behind when fathers, husbands, and brothers went to war. During the 4.5 years of fighting, those on the home front lived with the fear of Zeppelin raids, starvation, and the arrival of the telegram bearing the dreaded words, "Killed in action."
We used to sing the song, "Keep the home fires burning. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home." And my mother always at the end of it said, but some of them will never come home, you see.
I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day. And even over the years, when people did turn up, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if it was Ted?
These are the last voices of World War I. It was harvest time when Britain found herself at war with Germany in August 1914. To begin with, war seemed a glorious adventure to the million men who volunteered to take up arms, and to the families they left behind. Government war propaganda reached even the smallest villages, which were emptied of young men eager to exchange life on the farm for the glamour of life in uniform. Len Whitehead was 7 when his brother George joined the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment.
Everybody terribly excited. Nobody more excited than my elder brother George. He was so keen to go. He went into my mother's bedroom. She was not very well at the time and was in bed. And he picked up a stick, tucked it under his arm and marched about the bedroom. "This is how I shall strut about the London parks," he said, jokingly, of course. And we sang him the little song. "No more will I work in the harvest field to reap the golden corn, but I'm going to join the army and I'm off tomorrow morn." I don't think it occurred to any of them that they might never come back again. It was a sort of glamour of it all. But he did go, and we watched him out of sight with a sort of parcel tucked under his arm with his towel and shaving gear and that sort of thing. Yes, he went.
Civic pride meant that towns and cities competed with one another to attract the most recruits, and new so-called PALS battalions were made up of men from the same street, factory or football team. Being amongst the first wave to volunteer for Lord Kitchener's army was seen as a badge of honour and manhood, and Kathleen Barron felt proud when her elder brother Dick joined up in 1914.
I looked up to him for everything, because I was sure he'd give me the right answer. And just how it was when you're very young, you think your brother's wonderful. And he looked wonderful. He was very handsome. So, poor little me adored him. To see him go was heartbreaking. But, yeah, he had to go.
It didn't take long for the war to come to Britain. As the British Expeditionary Force set sail for the front in 1914, Parks and gardens across the country were transformed into training grounds for the new recruits of Kitchener's Volunteer Army. It was the first glimpse many on the home front had of the brutality of warfare.
We saw these boys, and they were all sticking bayonets into sacks of straw on the trees where children used to play. And they were running towards them and told just whereabouts in the sack that bayonet had to go. So then we knew what that was.
Many of the young men who joined up to fight had to face the heartache of saying goodbye to their girlfriends. In Liverpool, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had joined the army before the outbreak of war. But as the date of his departure to France loomed nearer, he began to have serious regrets.
He was worried to death, and I was trying to comfort him. I didn't know what to say. I knew nothing about war or anything like that, but all I could do was to tell him to look on the bright side, that there were better days in store when it was all over. But he was quite convinced that he was going to be killed. We were desperately in love with each other, and we made that promise that as soon as the war was over, which was about Christmas, we'd get engaged. It was a promise, and that was it. So that was a promise he went away with in his heart, that it wouldn't be for long.
But it wasn't only single men who volunteered to fight. And for children whose fathers went off to war, it was an especially worrying time. Ruth Armstrong grew up in the village of Tilshead in Wiltshire.
My father said to my mother, "Oh, I've got to go. My group is called up, and I've got to go. I've got to go tomorrow." And of course, she was very, very upset. And us two children, oh well, the end of the world had come for us with Daddy gone. Well, I miss my dad so much. I used to cry every night for him. And I used to say a little prayer and ask God to send him back.
10-year-old Lucy Walter from Kidderminster never forgot the moment when her father wished her a last goodbye.
In the evening, my father said, "I've got to go back now. I'm back to Kidderminster, back to the barracks. And will you walk with me a little way, just up the hill? Will you come with me?" And of course I would. We went off down the road and then up this hill. And I was held onto his hand so tight, I can remember that. And when we got to the top, he said, "No, I won't take you any further. You must go back now." And he picked me up against him and put his arm, held me tight to him, and he kissed me. And he put me down and he said, "Well, you must go now. Wave to me at the bottom, won't you?" And I went. I left him there, standing there, and I went down the hill and I kept looking back and he was still there. And I got to the bottom, then I got to turn off to go to where we lived. And I stopped and waved to him, and he waved back. And he gestured like that, as much, "Go on, you must go home now," sort of thing, you know, gently like that. And then he waved.
With families across the country now separated, there followed an anxious wait as Britain's men went to war. Some would never see their homes and loved ones again. By the spring of 1915, it was clear that Kitchener's men were needed in France without delay, and final preparations were made for their departure. Living close to Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong heard the Artillery Corps fine-tuning their skills for the battles ahead.
We used to get the guns firing over the village, and it was really terrible because the house used to shake, and that was practicing of course, and the policeman used to come around on his bike, knock at the doors, and he would say, "Well, missus, open your windows a bit tonight. There's going to be a bit of fun tonight." And of course they fired right over the village. You could hear them whiz over the village. Under the bed my brother used to get. I used to get under the pillows. Used to really shake the houses.
But there was soon a far more frightening vision appearing in the skies above Wiltshire. The Zeppelin. The first air raid on Britain took place on the 19th of January 1915, when 2 Zeppelins dropped bombs on Great Yarmouth, killing 4 civilians. A further 19 raids took place that year, causing widespread damage and claiming 181 lives.
One evening, it was not all that dark. We were sitting indoors playing games on the table, snakes and ladders and all that sort of thing. And we heard a lot of screaming, and we all run out. "Oh, there's a Zeppelin coming. Oh, Kaiser's coming." Everybody got out in the road screaming, and they didn't know what to make of it. And my brother got all worried about it, and he said, "Oh, old Kaiser's going to jump out of that Zeppelin and take the lot of us. What are we going to do?" And then my little friend said, "We ought to go and get the policeman." I said, "What can the policeman do?" I said that if the Kaiser comes down, he'd take the policeman as well. And my mother got a bit worried herself, I think, so she said, "The Germans will never have you. They will never have you." She said, "We're not going to live under German rule. No way." She said, so I said, "Well, what will you do, Mummy?" Well, she said, "It's an awful thing to tell you, but she said, I should wait till you're asleep, and I should put your pillow over your head, and then I should do the same to myself. The Germans are not going to rule me, nor my children."
To begin with, Britain's air defences were weak, and few Zeppelins were shot down. When they were, there was little sympathy for the crew on board.
It was like a long silver pencil, all on fire, right up in the sky. And the neighbours was hooraying, and Germans, you know. I said, "But they're men burning, alive." All I could think of, they were burning alive. And I rushed indoors. I couldn't stand it.
This propaganda film recreated the destructive power of the airship, the indiscriminate nature of their bombs earning them the nickname the Baby Killers. They were scenes familiar to 10-year-old Madge Maindonald, who was caught in an air raid in London.
It was the people screaming that got me down. 1 or 2 had lost their child or their partner or something, and they were calling and trying to find each other, and everybody was laying on the floor. We weren't standing up, and people were trying to, and calling, "John, John, where are you, John? Oh, for Christ's sake, John, speak to me," and things like that, and I'm praying, "Please God." Well, I couldn't see the sense of that. I really couldn't see the sense of that.
There were only a few safe air raid shelters and little protection for civilians. Yet after the initial panic, the reaction to the raids was one of fierce resistance. The random killing of women and children was a propaganda gift which helped strengthen national unity. After most raids, it was business as usual, and all feelings of fear were suppressed, even amongst the children.
We got up in the morning, and I went to school, and I got late, because we'd only had about half an hour's sleep. I got told off for being late, which was very unusual because I was a very punctual child. And I never said a word. And I couldn't talk about it.
Back on the Western Front, in the autumn of 1915, the Allies launched their first major attempt to break through the German lines near the French coal mining town of Luz. It was the first real test for Kitchener's volunteers. It It was here that Len Whitehead's elder brother George went over the top. His body was never found.
The first we knew of it, of his being killed, was a pal of his who joined up at much the same time, wrote to my mother, "Dear Mrs. Whitehead, I am writing to tell you your son George has been killed." My mother, of course, burst into tears. "Don't read any more," she said. And after a time, when she calmed down a little, she said to me, "Go and tell your father." My father was ploughing in a field near to the farmhouse, and I waited for him to finish about with his plough and 2 horses. "George has been killed," I told him. And he didn't answer, but left his horses all steaming in the mild late October weather, and we walked back in silence to the house. When we got to the house, he went to the bottom of the stairs and called up, "That's all right, ain't it?" He made no attempt to go up to comfort my mother, but went into the kitchen, sat in his wooden armchair and put his arms on the table and his head on his arms for a little while, wept, I think. Then he went back to his ploughing.
The Battle of Lewes had been a failure, and British casualties totalled around 20,000 men. But it was just a foretaste of things to come. With so many men away at the front, women began to enter the workforce in large numbers, often having to do the jobs previously undertaken by skilled and semi-skilled men. By 1917, 1 million women were doing what had once been men's jobs in the munitions factories. To begin with, Daisy Collingwood was keen to do her patriotic duty.
I felt when I was working on munitions, I really thought, oh, I haven't got any brothers to go and fight, I'm doing the next best thing, and I was quite pleased to be able to do it.
The pressure to meet production targets meant that 12-hour shifts day and night were common.
I had never stayed up all night in my life when I started on night work. I never thought I'd get through that shift. But I did. Like everything else, it's surprising what you can do when you've got to.
But the health and welfare of the women was often sacrificed in the production drive. Around 1,000 munitions workers would die, many of them in factory explosions, like this one at Silvertown in London's East End. Daisy Collingwood was a lucky survivor, but was so mentally distressed she was unable to continue working.
It was as though the whole world shook with the noise of the explosion. I've never heard a noise like it. But of course, not only me, all those working in the building were all shot around. The place was just a shambles.
To make ends meet, many families began to send their young children out to work to help pay for the food essential to their survival. Over 500,000 were withdrawn early from school to be used as child labour. At the age of 9, Dennis Gilfeather began work in the Dundee jute mills.
We're starting at 6 in the morning until 6 at night. You had 2 breaks through the day, 9 to 10 and 1 to 2. And it was 5.5 days. You worked 54 hours a week and you got £1 and a penny. But that was gold in these days. I was a very, very proud boy when I got my pay and took it home to my mum. I knew it should make her happy, and it certainly made me very happy. And I felt I was 6 feet tall instead of 5 feet 6.
Children who remained in school were also expected to do their bit for the war effort. In Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong's teacher encouraged her pupils to take up knitting for the cause.
We made scarves and balaclavas and socks and gloves. I'd done scarves because I wasn't much of a hand at knitting. And then she wanted us to write to the soldiers out in the front, you know, and to cheer them up. And I got an answer from one of them, and he told me, he said how very happy he was to get my letter, and he hadn't had a letter from anyone for 6 weeks, and he had this letter from me and how it cheered him up.
In 1916, 14-year-old Kathleen Barron began work as a pianist in her local cinema, accompanying newsreels as they flickered on the silver screen above her.
I so loved playing the piano. I got this job, much to my amazement, and it was the silent films, of course, and all the different films about the war, and I had to play accordingly. I was told that I had a lot of expression in my playing, which is touch, gentle touch, and yet firmness of the fingers. And according to what was on, so I would look and play just from my mind, no music, what that would coincide with that film. If it was bombing, a terrible fight, I would know what sort of music to play.
Kathleen couldn't have known it, but she would soon be playing along with some of the most remarkable images ever captured on film. On the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. The government was so confident of victory, it allowed cameramen to film the troops in action. 20 million would watch these scenes of trench warfare, some real, some reconstructed, in cinemas all over Britain. For the first time, families back home glimpsed the horrors of trench warfare.
It almost seemed unreal to me. You know, it couldn't be going on. But of course it was. And the terror of it affected me. And yet I could feel the sadness and the horror from the audience. But you could feel it.
The battle raged on until the end of November. In 5 months of fighting, over 600,000 British and Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In towns and villages that had raised PALS battalions, the effects were devastating. Entire communities went into mourning as across the country, the dreaded telegram was delivered with an ever-increasing regularity. By the winter of 1916, the spirit of patriotism that had once gripped the country had all but disappeared. The losses on the Somme had shocked the nation, and every day those at home lived in fear of the arrival of an official letter or telegram bearing bad news.
People used to dread seeing the little telegraph boys come on the bikes. It was nearly always to say that somebody had been killed. It made you afraid of that telegraph boy coming to the door. You didn't want to see him. You were hoping he'd keep away. You didn't want him because he always had bad news.
In Liverpool, Kathleen Barron and her family waited nervously for news about her brother Dick.
In those days, the postman knocked on the door, and my mother used to say, "Go and fetch the letters," which I did. And if there was one that was a buff colour, and it had "On His Majesty's Service" on it, my mother couldn't open she couldn't open the letters. And she used to say, "You open them, you open them." So I had to open them.
The letter most feared was Army Form B10482. It contained the blunt message, "Killed in action," and was now being received by tens of thousands of families. Dennis Gilfeather's father was killed in France, fighting with the King's Own Scottish borderers.
When this happened, when the official news came through the door, my mother had the wee boy in a high chair, and we were round the table, and she was attending to us. When the telegram boy came, my mother went to the door and she got this telegram. She'd opened it, looked at it, collapsed on the floor. And the eldest boy said, "Get through to Mrs. Lawson and get her." So this was a neighbour. I had knocked on her door and she come out, and she says, "What's the matter, son?" I said, "My mum's collapsed." And when she came through and she attended my mother and washed her face, gave her a cup of tea. And then suddenly the news was out now. The news that my father wasn't going to see him again. You're stuck with that. This thing didn't leave your mind for years. You're not going to see your dad again.
It was very difficult for those back home to come to terms with the sudden loss, with no body to bury and little or no information on the circumstances of death.
The postman brought a letter, and my mother opened it, and she sat there, and all she said was, "Oh, he's dead." And then she did begin to cry. I don't remember crying. I felt so stunned I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I'd never see him again. But oh dear, I did cry at night, because I remembered my father always tucked me up and he always kissed my forehead and said, "Good night, Lulu, God bless you." Every night, he never failed. And I did miss that so much. I really did. I suppose in a way I was heartbroken. I was.
By 1917, the main German strategy to win the war was through a naval blockade, sinking the Allied merchant fleet and starving Britain into submission. In just 1 month, German U-boats destroyed 371 merchant ships bringing food to Britain. With 2/3 of the country's food supply coming from overseas, there would soon be a crisis on the home front.
The only time we had a meal really was on the Sunday, when we used to have a dinner on a Sunday. That was practically the only real meal we had in the week. And the bread was black, almost black. Couldn't get white bread, never. And there wasn't much of anything. And people starved. Did you know people starved? If you were hungry, you didn't tell anybody, you didn't go begging. Why would you? People didn't, they had their pride. I wouldn't have told anybody I was hungry.
My mother, I don't know how she managed. We were starving. If the war went on another 4 months, I don't know what would have happened. My mother, she was done everything she can for both of us, my little brother and me. She'd done everything she could. It was nothing to see her sit at the table with an empty plate. "Mummy, you're not eating." "Well, I'm not hungry." Whatever she had was for my brother and myself. And my mother and grandmother used to go out in the fields, with the permission of the farmers, of course, and pick the greens off the turnips and the Swedes, take them home and cook them with potatoes and mash it up with margarine. That was our Sunday dinner. Mother used to say, "Eat it up and imagine that you're having a nice roast dinner." And we made ourselves believe it. And it went down good because we were hungry.
A production drive in the countryside was desperately needed to help make the country more self-sufficient in food. But many of the young farm workers had been amongst the first wave of volunteers to go to the front, and with them had gone most of the horses of rural England, now being commandeered for service by the army.
When they took the horses, it upset me very much. We only had 4. 2 of them were beautiful Shire-type horses. They took those, and another bay mare which wasn't quite as big. Left us just with 1 horse. Meant an awful lot to us, the horses. Boxer, Duke and Violet were their names. Never saw them again, of course.
According to government propaganda and popular legend, the Women's Land Army helped overcome the food production crisis as middle-class volunteers gave up their comfortable suburban lives to work on the farms. In fact, few were prepared to make the sacrifice, and even fewer farmers wanted them. They were still only 16,000 strong by the end of the war, and they made little impact. But alongside them came a fresh supply of manpower, the Army Agricultural Labour Corps, many of whom were disabled ex-soldiers, like 19-year-old George Louth from Hampshire. George had fought in the Battle of the Somme and was sent home from the trenches, suffering from partial deafness and nervous exhaustion.
I didn't know how a potato grew, never mind about haymaking. And we went to this farm, and we was there a fortnight. And he sent us back. Said we were no good. So the officer said to me, "Well, look," he said, "if you can't do anything on the land, it's no good you stopping here. You'll have to go back to France again." I said, "Oh no." I said, "Is there some tractor drivers being wanted somewhere? Is that what you want to do?" I said, "Yes, sir."
At least George had now escaped the nightmare of trench warfare.
I felt free, didn't I, after all that trauma? It disappeared. It disappeared altogether. As though it was yesterday.
1917 saw some of the bitterest fighting of the war, and the dreadful battles of Arras and Passchendaele have since become synonymous with suffering on an unimaginable scale. As the war dragged on, the tragic news of losses continued to reach people across the land. Before he left for the front, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had promised they would get engaged at the end of the war. It was a promise he would be unable to keep.
I was working at the Palace Hotel, Buxton, and one of the porters came up with this letter from the War Office, official looking. And when I saw it, my heart sank a little bit. I thought it must be something very, very important. And when I opened it, it was to say that they regretted to tell me that Edward had been killed. The letters from me were found on his body, and that's why they could find out where I was. I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I couldn't imagine it. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day.
Grief could have a devastating physical impact on women who were already weakened by overwork and starvation. A contemporary survey found that 1 in 8 war widows died within a year of their soldier husbands. 6 months after losing her husband, Dennis Gilfeather's mother was seriously ill in hospital.
You think that the whole world's changing, the sunshine's leaving your life. Your mother's in bed and she's very ill. As she's now, you can't go, Mum. You must, you know, all love you so much. And she looked at me and she said, you look after them. If anything happens to me, you look after the bairn and Dan. I was the 2 youngest. You've been graded up and you have to stay strong. But your stomach was tumbling with nerves and the worry in case you lost your mum.
Dennis was lucky. His mother survived, and the extra money he earned working in the jute mills helped to keep his family together. By 1918, the war had entered its final phase. The German offensive of the spring had failed, and the Allies were now pushing towards victory. At home, the introduction of rationing and one of the best harvests for years had helped quell the food shortages. 4 years of suffering and privation were at last coming to an end. But for many on the home front, the end of the war was just the beginning of a new and unexpected chapter in their lives. In November 1918, the guns on the fields of Flanders at last fell silent, and across Britain, crowds turned out onto the streets to mark the occasion. But for the families of the 750,000 British men killed in the fighting, there was little to celebrate. Len Whitehead's older brother George had been killed in 1915.
My mother was very sad. She didn't want to take part in any celebrations or anything like that. We didn't hear the armistice had been signed until very late in the afternoon. We were isolated on a farm, you see. But my mother didn't take any part in any celebrations. One of her precious family wasn't coming home, and it made her sad, of course. You see, we used to sing the song, "Keep the home fires burning." Everybody's heard that, of course. Keep the home fires burning while the hearts are yearning. Though the lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home. And then my mother always finished up, but some of the poor boys won't ever come home. And so it was always there, the fact that he would not come home again.
Kathleen Barron's brother Dick was one of those lucky enough to make it home. Although it would take him many years to recover from a case of severe dysentery that had nearly killed him.
I would pray, quite believing that God would bring him back. And he did. Of course, he came back very ill, terribly ill. But he came back. I've never seen my mother look so beautiful as she did when she saw her son. It was the elation, the lovely feeling of seeing him. She really did. I couldn't believe it. She looked so lovely. He wasn't quite the, what shall I say, happy-go-lucky, fun-loving person that he was. You see, he'd altered. I mean, he'd suffered a lot, nearly died, and that alters people, doesn't it? Because he wasn't really quite well, even then. Far from well, really. But there you are, we had him back. We had him home.
After her sweetheart Ted was killed earlier in the war, Florence Billington married a sailor called Sid. But she never forgot Ted and the promise that he was unable to keep, that he would come home and marry her after the war.
Couldn't settle down, thinking of him. That's what it was. It made me all unsettled. I made up my mind that one day I would go over there and try to find the place where he'd fallen, which I did. I didn't find a place where I saw the memorial there and his name and everything, but I thought about him a lot, and he came to me several times in spirit. Yes, told me he thought he kept thinking of me, and he loved me with all his heart, and that was the one thing he didn't like to leave me when he went. But he did. He came back a few times and has done over the years. So that's how it is.
For many fathers returning home to their families, it was a wonderful occasion, tinged only with the sadness that they had missed the joys of watching their children grow up. But some could never readjust to the normality of family life.
My father and mother was never the same again. And it happened to so many families. After my father had been home some little time, things seemed to, I don't know, go funny between my father and mother. And I found out afterwards that he had been accusing her of carrying on the soldier. And a New Zealander, he reckoned it was, because we were surrounded with New Zealanders. And he found this letter, you see. Dear Kitty, I'm so sorry I haven't seen you lately, but I still got the children's comics for them. Hope to see you soon. Lots of love, Con. Of course, she got in an awful temper about it because she told him straight she, you know, it was a lot of lies. But he wouldn't listen. He got it in his head, and he was a changed man. And what he wanted to do was clear out and take me. And he wanted to, anyway, in the end they parted. And I broke my heart. Oh, I broke my heart.
After being sent home from the trenches with partial deafness and nervous exhaustion, George Louth spent the remainder of the war working on the land in Dorset. There he met Ella, the daughter of his landlady, and after an 8-month courtship, George proposed.
I said, will you marry me? She was shook. So then we decided, when we went indoors, and we gave the news to the mother-in-law, and she clapped. She clapped because she never had a son-in-law like that before.
George and Ella married on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1918.
Got married, and as we came out of that Blandford, we see all the flags flying. We thought it was for us. And it wasn't, it was Armistice Day, 11 o'clock. But we got married. And we done it now. We did that then, married for 70 years.
The hunger and hardship on the home front will always be overshadowed by the far greater suffering and death of soldiers on the front line. But for those who lived through it, the devastating impact the war had on the family life of the nation will never be forgotten. In a remarkable exercise spanning the past 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men who were there. Now, to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the armistice, these extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this last film, we hear from the veterans who fought on the Western Front during 1918. Many were young conscripts rushed to the front to make up the numbers as the Germans launched a final brutal offensive. Thousands were taken prisoner and endured months of cruel treatment at the hands of their captors. It would take a final supreme effort by the Allies to win the war, and the human cost would be terrible.
For the first time I realized I may go die, and I'd never experienced anything like it before, and I was terrified. I was shaking.
Being taken prisoner was the most horrible thing I'd ever imagined could happen to me. It made me feel as if I was a coward. I was letting my country down, I was letting my battalion down, I was letting my family down, and it was a horrible, horrible feeling.
These are the last voices of World War I. On the Western Front, 1918 began with both sides recovering from the bloody war of attrition fought at Passchendaele. Although casualties had been enormous, the Allies had not made the breakthrough they had hoped for. And although by now America had joined the fighting, it would be months before her troops began to appear on the battlefields in significant numbers. In the meantime, the October Revolution in Russia brought her war with Germany to a close, and the German army now began to transport huge reserves of men and materials westwards. Now fielding more divisions than the Allies, the time had come for the Germans to launch what they hoped would be a final, brutal offensive. The German spring offensive began on the 21st of March 1918. It was a date significant to one-time shoe repairer Jack Rogers, who had been on the Western Front for nearly 3 years. It was the day of his 24th birthday, and he was busy making plans for his first leave of the war.
So I'd written to my mother and told her, please don't send any cakes or anything else for my birthday, because I'm on the way home. I should be coming home and I should be there for my birthday, because I thought I was going on the 20th, you see. But prior to the 21st, on the 19th or 20th, all leave was cancelled, so we couldn't go.
Intelligence reports had prepared the Allies for a likely offensive, and as a trained marksman, Jack Rogers was one of those sent into the forward zone to help repel any attack.
We were sent out there at the night to occupy that trench because they were anticipating the German attack the next day. We were told to stop there at all costs. There was about, I think it was 8 of us altogether at the time then. We were in this little trench, and there we stopped. And then the morning came, and about 6 to 7 o'clock in the morning, the Germans opened up, as anticipated, the big barrage.
Dawn had brought with it a thick fog, and after a heavy artillery bombardment, elite German stormtrooper units rushed through the mist towards the Allied lines. Moving quickly, they bypassed frontline defences and instead targeted artillery positions and supply depots in the rear. Before they knew it, frontline troops like Jack Rogers found themselves outflanked and completely surrounded. After serving as a stretcher-bearer during the Battle of Passchendaele, 19-year-old Bill Easton from Norfolk was another caught by surprise at the speed and ferocity of the German attack.
They came from the back of us, you know, where our line used to be. They simply came there with loudspeakers shouting out, "Throw your arms down and we won't fire."
With Allied units at the rear in a state of confusion, the next wave of German troops moved forward, capturing trenches and the British soldiers who had little option but to surrender.
We could see Germans galore in every direction at the back of us. One came straight for me, and he got a fixed bayonet. He come rushing straight up to me, and from that moment on, I said goodbye. There was no more of me, that was the finish. I expected that bayonet to go straight into me, but it didn't. Strange enough, when he got up to me, he stopped. And the thing he said to me was, "Cigaretten, comrade?" I nearly dropped to the ground with surprise. Cigaretten? I thought he wants a cigarette. So I felt in my pocket where I carried a little tin of ready-made cigarettes, and I said, "Yes." And he took some of them, and he put them in his pocket, and then I put the tin back. And that was my birthday, the 21st of March, 1918.
Within just 2 days, the British Army was in full retreat and thousands were taken prisoner. The British were desperate for reserves to make up the numbers, and at home, new recruits and conscripts were told to prepare for action. With the age of frontline service now reduced, many of these new soldiers were just 18 years old. One of them was Fred Hodges, a patriotic grammar school boy from Northampton. Fred had wanted to be a soldier from the beginning of the war and volunteered for service when he was just 17.
Well, of course, every boy wanted to be in the army. Within days of the war beginning, we had 25,000 Welshmen here in the town. They were billeted in all the homes. And we had 2 nice young men, and of course I used to try their hats on and their tunics and fancy myself as a soldier. It was a natural feeling amongst boys. We thought that conscripts were men who had been drilled and made to do things, whereas we were free. We were volunteers. We should be better soldiers than them.
Oi! You! Come here! I'm talking to you!
However, not all young men were as patriotic as Fred, and before the introduction of conscription, many had to be coerced into joining up. In towns and villages across Britain, recruiting officers scoured the streets on the lookout for likely new recruits who were cajoled or bullied into the army. 18-year-old Welsh boy Percy Williams only joined up after he was promised that it would be at least a year until he saw frontline action.
I was hoping and hoping that the war would be finished before I was called up. I had no patriotism. You may call me a bit of a coward, but I didn't want to join the army because I knew. I could see by the casualty list that so many had died.
But with the launch of the German offensive, Percy's hopes of a quick end to the war were shattered, and just months after his 18th birthday, his training was cut short and he was sent into action. As the Germans prepared for their next attack, the boys of 1918 readied themselves for the baptism of fire that awaited them. In March 1918, the German army had launched the first of a series of lightning attacks in a final bid to win the war. With their numbers boosted by the arrival of troops from the Eastern Front and the employment of new tactics, they had smashed through Allied lines, capturing ground and prisoners alike. With the Allies desperate for reinforcements, thousands of reserves had their training cut short in readiness for action. One of these was 18-year-old volunteer Fred Hodges.
On the 21st of March, the German big attack started. On the 24th, our training ceased, cut off just like that. We were equipped for the front. The general had told us we were inspected in a big park in Norwich. Then he got up on his dais and he said, "You men? Well, of course I know that you're not men, you're only boys. But the Germans have broken through our fortifications and you're needed at the front at once." He said, "You've got to play the part of men." We didn't think of the danger.
Fred couldn't wait to join the action, and in his boyish enthusiasm gave little thought to the effect his leaving would have on his parents.
I put my arms around my mother and she was crying and she said, "If you don't come back," I don't know what she was going to say, but I interrupted that and said, "Oh, I shall come back, don't worry about that, I shall come back." And it was such an emotional moment for me that I'm afraid I broke away from her and left her, still in that fearful state.
As Fred and his colleagues boarded the trains that would take them to the coast, on the other side of the channel, thousands of Allied prisoners were beginning their journey into captivity. Jack Rogers was one of those captured on the 21st of March, the day of his 24th birthday.
And they took us for a walk till we got to a railway line. And there they forced us into these cattle trucks. We had to go into them with about 30 or 40 in a truck. They packed us all in as fast as they could till we passed where we must have filled the train. For the train kept moving and it moving. And we were in that train without anything to eat or drink for about 2 days, with just this little ventilator at the top near the roof there was, where you could breathe through. Till finally we got out of a station, and that station was in Germany.
18-year-old stretcher bearer Bill Easton was another captured on the first day of the German offensive. After marching their prisoners to a holding camp, the Germans asked for volunteers to help treat wounded British POWs held in a nearby church. Bill was the only volunteer.
And when I got in, all on the floor, right up this main aisle, whatever they call it. There were people laying on the floor. Do you know, when I counted, there was just on 40 men there. They got wounded in the shoulders, arms, and all sorts of things. I started on them. And at any rate, the next morning, the sergeant came. And he came up there, he said to me, he said, my first mission, he said, is to thank you on behalf of my commanding officer. He said, and if he was here himself, he'd like to shake your hand for volunteering to do this job. And those Germans, they called me straight away Klein Englander, the little Englander.
Following the success of their first attack, the Germans now launched further offensives along the Allied lines. For the many new recruits now making up Allied numbers, including reluctant volunteer Percy Williams, the first experience of artillery bombardment was even worse than they'd expected.
All hell let loose. I'd never been under shell fire before, and I was nearly sick with fright. Nearly sick with fright. For the first time I realized that I may go die. And I'd never experienced anything like it before. And I was terrified. I was shaking. And there was a gas attack before, and we had to put on our gas mask, and the gas mask got covered with a film, and you couldn't see. And then I was faint-hearted and sick, and I felt sick. So I had to take the gas off and vomit as best as I could. You see, it was fear. It was probably cowardice, but I could not help it. I'd never experienced anything so terrible in my life.
On the 9th of April, the Germans redirected the main thrust of their offensive towards Allied defences along the River Lys. When the attack began, 18-year-old volunteer Ernie Stevens from Middlesex had been in France for just 24 hours.
And suddenly we heard this chatter of a machine gun behind us. It was obvious that the Germans had broken through and had got round to the rear of us.
As machine gun bullets rattled around them, Ernie's platoon commander realised there was no chance of escape.
And he said to me, Corporal, he said, the only thing I can suggest is, if you have a handkerchief, would you bring it out, tie it to the end of your bayonet, and indicate to the Germans that we were prepared to surrender. Being taken prisoner was the most horrible thing I'd ever imagined could happen to me. It made me feel as if I was a coward. I was letting my country down, I was letting my battalion down, I was letting my family down. And it was a horrible, horrible feeling. I've never had a feeling like it in all my life.
After being hit in the leg by shrapnel, Percy Williams was also captured.
This German came with his fixed bayonet, and I thought he was going to kill me. And I was petrified, and he said, halt, halt, halt. And they were big chaps. Oh, the Germans were big fellows. We were lads of 18, just boys. So I I gave up the line of resistance. I'm glad that my life had been saved. Because if I'd put up any resistance, well, you'd be bayoneted.
Further along the line, Fred Hodges was about to have his first encounter with the advancing Germans.
It was dusk, and in the front we could see the flickering and star shells going up. And then we saw a plane coming towards us, very low, could see a black outline in the darkish sky, and Corporal Hobson, a regular soldier, he said, "Don't worry lads, it's one of ours." And then the bombs dropped, and we'd just passed an empty trench. So we turned round and scuttled back, and Corporal Hobson got a bit pushed. And he said, "I thought I'd brought some men up the line, not a lot of bloody scared kids." That settled us. We never showed fear again.
But the Germans soon became victims of their own success, and major tactical flaws in their battle plan appeared. By advancing too quickly, the Germans struggled to get supplies forward to support their frontline troops, who were left exhausted and exposed. And by leading the attacks with their elite stormtrooper units, the highest number of casualties suffered was amongst these highly trained, irreplaceable soldiers. These factors combined would ultimately lead to the downfall of the German advance. But in the meantime, the British prisoners captured in the spring were getting their first taste of life in captivity.
We were herded into this cage, and it seemed that every few minutes the gate was unlocked and in came another bunch. We were not given blankets or bedding, anything at all. We just had to lie on the ground and sleep as best we could. And during that time, they did not give us a drink, and they did give us maybe about 4 or 6 of their emergency rations, which were like dog biscuits. And that was only on the 3rd day. So obviously we were very, very thirsty. We'd had nothing to drink, nothing whatsoever. But it was not a fair way of dealing with unfortunate prisoners who couldn't do anything about it. And that's what you are. You're a prisoner of war. You can't do a thing. Otherwise, you might find a bullet through your head.
Not all POWs were taken immediately to prison camps. After volunteering to stay at the front to help treat wounded Allied prisoners, Bill Easton was well treated by his captors, who took a liking to the young man they called the Little Englander. In an extraordinary ceremony, Bill was made an honorary sergeant by the Germans, a moment captured in this remarkable photograph.
I was invited to a celebration for their big victory, and when I went there was all this company, this field ambulance, and they all shouted out Willem, because that's the nearest they get to William. And they were cheering and shouting and go ahead, and people were coming shaking hands with me. And then the Sergeant Major, he announced the fact that they were going to honour me for making me a sergeant, and that if I gave an order, their men would obey it. And that's why I was made sergeant. I was honorary sergeant. And those fellas went wild. They cheered.
But Bill's privileges weren't to last, and as the German advance began to falter, he was sent to a labour camp. He joined thousands of Allied prisoners held captive in Germany, who were forced into a routine blighted by hardship, disease and starvation. Many would never see home again. For many Allied POWs, life under their German captors revolved around periods of forced labour. In the days before the Geneva Convention, Both sides had agreed to abide by a set of principles that governed the treatment of prisoners. In particular, no captured men were supposed to be used in work that assisted the enemy's war effort, but this principle was regularly flouted by both sides. 18-year-old Ernie Stevens was sent to work at this soda factory in the town of Rheinberg. Having only ever worked in an office, he found manual labour extremely hard.
It was tough. I mean, this is the kind of work that I was not used to. I am what they commonly called in England a pen pusher. So that coming suddenly to breaking up rock or unloading a truck that filled with coal was something new to me and very hard. It's not an easy job, not by any means. Anyway, it's what we had to do. If we didn't do it, then we didn't get our meal. Not until we'd finished.
For those thought to be shirking their responsibilities, the punishment was brutal, as 18-year-old Bill Easton found to his cost.
You'd be working at a camp, and the slightest thing that had gone wrong, the guards used to get annoyed, and then you'd probably get a bang with a rifle butt, which anybody who's had it know that's very painful. You'd feel that for days, let alone anything else, because those rifles, they were shod with brass, heavy brass, and you really feel as if they were going right through you.
But being one of the youngest and weakest, Bill Easton often found that the older prisoners came to his aid, even if it meant they were on the receiving end of a beating themselves.
In the main, I was well protected by people that I was working with. They used to call me the kid sometimes. They'd say, keep your eye on the kid. And if there were signs of one of these warders approaching, they'd all get round me, and I was supposed to be wheeling barrel loads of this stuff up. Well, I couldn't push the barrel. And somehow or other, one or the other of them, he'd get a bang instead of me.
Despite the risk of punishment, when the guards turned their backs, many prisoners did their best to help disrupt the German war effort. Loading coal onto trucks at the soda factory, Ernie Stevens regularly did what little he could to fight back.
My duty was to do what I could to make it awkward for the Germans. I wasn't, in that sense, their friend at all. There were occasions when sentries would not be in my immediate vicinity, and I would just open the side door of the truck and let the coal out. If I could get away with it, good. And I used to look so innocent and say, oh gee, the door must have come open. And I suppose I looked so innocent they took my word. I don't know.
The final desperate push in the German offensive of 1918 was launched on the 15th of July. Within days it had ground to a halt, and with the Americans now on the battlefields in numbers, the initiative returned to the Allies. On the 8th of August, the Allies attacked the Germans at Amiens. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost almost 30,000 men in what their commander, Ludendorff, called the Black Day of the German Army. It was just the beginning of a rolling offensive which would last 100 days and be remembered as the most successful campaign in the history of the British Army. As the August offensive began, Fred Hodges sat alone in a trench, contemplating the wonder of life and the beauty of nature that surrounded him.
You were struck with the contrast between the horror that we men had created over 4 years and that nature was proceeding in its quiet, beautiful way. I had an eye and a feeling for it. I don't think some men noticed it. At night, you're all alone. You might be the only man in the world. And you look around and there's nothing going on. Then something comes up from the German side like this. Momentarily, you think, oh, that was. And then you notice the stars. And I tried to remember what some of them were named. And then on a still day, you'd see white clouds lazily drifting over the battlefront. Larks singing above your head. And nature was going on just the same.
Back in Germany, the POWs were unaware of Allied successes at the front. The priority for most was simply finding something to eat. The British blockade of German ports had left the country short of food, and prisoners were not a high priority when it came to feeding the population. Jack Rogers had been a prisoner since March and was now suffering from severe malnutrition.
I was nearly falling to pieces. I nearly fell to pieces. Oh, I could, well, tell you the truth, you're falling through your britches. Absolutely, you don't know what you're going to do. You'd almost steal anything to try and get something to eat. If you could only get a crust of bread or something like that. And I lost over 2 stone easily. Might have been more, but I didn't get the chance of being weighed because just the little light jacket and thin things I'd got on were almost falling off me. And we got in an awful state.
Although the Red Cross provided regular food parcels for those whose details had been officially registered, many prisoners simply slipped through the net or had their rations stolen by their captors.
The whole of the time I was in Germany, I never had a parcel, always hungry. And we're thinking, oh my God, how long is this going to last? We just wanted to come out of it and get away from it. And I'd only been there a few months. Because of lack of food, I had all sores on my head. I was down from about 12 stone till about 6 or 7 stone.
As prisoners across Germany began to die from starvation and disease, back in France, Fred Hodges was developing a fascination with the dead on the battlefields.
I always went to look to see if I knew people. And we found 2 men, a German and a British, who had bayoneted one another. And this was a talking point for some time, people going over to see it. I saw a dead officer, and I picked up the corner of the ground sheet, and I thought, this is me. Your parents don't know you're dead. I had those queer thoughts that I knew what people don't know at home, he's dead.
After months in captivity, Ernie Stevens had had enough. Together with his friend Sid, he devised a plan to escape to freedom. It was a huge gamble. Failure could mean death.
We took it, I did it especially, very, very seriously. This was my life. You have to remember that. Because we could easily have had a bullet in the back. Very easily.
On their next shift at the soda factory, Ernie and Sid waited for the right moment before creeping away silently to the factory perimeter.
We climbed over the wall, crossed a road and into a field. It was a very large field, and we started off across that field to where we knew there was a hedge. Then we got to the the canal that we were looking for. Now, Sid, unfortunately, he got onto the pathway next to the canal, and it was stony. It had a lot of pebbles. As he walked along, you could hear him a mile off. I thought to myself, well, you're doing the wrong thing. But I dare not shout out at all, because my voice would carry in that very clear night air. And sure enough, it wasn't very long after that, just a matter of seconds really, I heard a German voice shout out, "Halt, hands up." And obviously he had walked right into a German sentry. And that was the end of freedom at the moment.
With Sid captured, Ernie decided to give himself up. They were returned to camp and punished with a period of solitary confinement, but lived to fight another day. By the end of August, the Allies had forced the Germans back to the Hindenburg Line from where they had begun their attack in the spring. As his battalion continued to advance, taking prisoners as they went, Fred Hodges became more and more confident of an Allied victory.
I felt that it was the end because we were capturing men who were not infantry. Old men with long tailcoats with buttons on. Cavalry, probably. And boys of 16. And I took prisoners. And I was all alone. And I came to a red brick farm, which hadn't been damaged. See, where we'd come from, it was all wrecked places. So I thought, well, I'm going in here to see. I went in and I found that they'd taken refuge in there, and they put their hands up as soon as they saw me. It was an easy capture. They were thankful to be prisoners. You can tell that from their attitude.
Having prisoners in his command had a profound effect on 18-year-old Fred.
I was completely in charge. In the army, you've got men under you and you've got officers and sergeant majors over you. But the war was mine. It was my personal war that morning. That's how I felt.
By the 5th of October, the Allies had broken through the Hindenburg Line, forcing the Germans to abandon their defences and retreat. Within weeks, the Allies would be celebrating their victory and the prisoners of war their freedom. At 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the Great War finally ended in victory for the Allies. In the 4 years of fighting, more than 1 million men from Britain and the Empire were killed, and over 2 million were wounded in perhaps the most terrible war in history. As jubilant soldiers marched through liberated towns and villages, Fred Hodges reflected on just how lucky he had been to survive.
When I heard from the dispatch rider, who had got it from brigade headquarters, that the war would end at 11 a.m, my first thought was very selfish. I thought, so I'm going to live. I was stunned, unbelief, and at the same time a secret joy that, so I'm going to have a life. I needn't fear that I shan't survive. I have survived.
For many POWs held in Germany, the end of the war came as a complete surprise. Jack Rogers was held captive here in the town of Münster. As he and his fellow prisoners were called out on parade on the 11th of November, the camp commandant had an unexpected greeting for them, instead of the usual abuse they had come to expect.
He used to call us Freilands every time, never addressed us any other way. But on this particular morning, his first word he said was,'Gentlemen.' He addressed us. He called us gentlemen. Well, you could just imagine the roar that went up in the air when he said, "Gentlemen." And he told us the war was over. You ought to have heard the noise. He couldn't keep us quiet. They just shouting and cheering and hooraying and all. It went on for, I think, hours nearly. We couldn't believe it. Everybody went mad. Oh, I felt like nothing on earth. I thought, what's it going to be like to be home just to see my people again, you know, to be free. Oh, I couldn't believe it.
Percy Williams was another who received the news of the armistice late. His malnutrition had become so serious, he had been transferred to a hospital in Bremen.
Well, we didn't know that we were going to be freed. We didn't know, because we were isolated. We got no newspapers, there was no radio. We couldn't believe our luck that after all this time, that the war was over and we'd go back to England. We were, of course, absolutely delighted. The
first prisoners to return to Britain were treated as heroes, and quaysides were packed with friends and relatives, waiting to welcome their loved ones home. But after months in captivity, many men, like Bill Easton, found it difficult to adjust to a life of freedom.
When I came home, I was all up in the air, to tell you the truth. I was absolutely bewildered. People say, "You're young Bill, aren't you?" And I could hardly answer them. And to tell you the truth, in the end, I got so fed up with congratulations that I didn't go out too much. I was a sort of recluse.
Ernie Stevens, who had been captured after just 24 hours in France, was another who had a traumatic homecoming.
It's very, very difficult to explain just how much that you've missed the love of your people. I know that coming home was not easy. Even though I'd been released as a prisoner of war, it was not easy at all. Because you're coming back to a new world again.
And for Ernie, that world would never be the same again. As jubilant crowds lined the streets, he returned home to the tragic news that his half-sister had died shortly before the end of the war. It was one more life lost amongst so many.
It was my stepfather that opened the door after I knocked. And he came to the door and he shouted, "Mum, it's Ernie." I'll never forget that. "Mum, it's Ernie." So Mum came out. And of course, obviously, there was hugging and kissing. And then it was a case of my mum telling me about my half-sister. Well, she told me that I should never see Gladys again because she had died of the flu and was buried on Armistice Day afternoon. As you can tell, it still hurts.
The Great War, one of the most catastrophic wars in human history, will very soon be beyond living memory. All of those interviewed for this series have since passed away. But in recording their experiences on film, it is hoped that their stories will live on, ensuring that their sacrifice and the sacrifice of millions like them will never be forgotten. The final words on the horrors of the war belong to them, beginning with Harry Patch, the last veteran to have served in the trenches. These are the last voices of the Great War.
Why have we lost millions of men and the Germans and all other people that was in that war? Why have we done that and then settled it round the damn table? Why couldn't they do that at first and save all those lives?
Oh no, we didn't think it was in vain, but I wouldn't volunteer again to do it. They'd have to call me up and do something, I don't know. We thought it was going to be a lovely little game, you know, but it wasn't. It was wicked. Wicked.
We all had great fun, really. Tremendous fun. Enjoyed ourselves. I personally enjoyed the Ruddy War, I think. I don't know why, but it was great fun.
Like me, you get sat by yourself, you know. Things goes through your mind, you think. And then, well, why did I join it? Well, all this, for any purpose. And I still think it was for no bloody purpose.
Well, it was all wrong, wasn't it? We shouldn't have been in it in the first place. As soldiering, I like soldiering, but I wasn't in the act really with it. No, it was all wrong.
I was happy. I knew I did something for my country. I felt happy, and I still feel happy. But yes, I still feel very happy that I was in that war and that came out. Because, as we say, if it hadn't been for us, a lot of people wouldn't be here today. And I still maintain that. Some of those fellas gave their lives so that other people could live. And I'm still content that they saved us all, they saved the country.